All right, now we should be live. For some reason, it didn't want to connect to the streaming service, so I had to restart and a few other things. Hopefully, there will be no further hiccups. If there are, you will hear me froth at the mouth. Apologies in advance for any mouth froth. This week, some more Luminous by Greg Egan, his short story collection. We've already read the titular story. Um, of Luminous, and this week, and of course I close it. There it is. Without the this week is Cocoon, and I don't actually remember what Cocoon's about. So in any case, hopefully people will enjoy. This one is a bit of a long one. It's like 40 pages, I think. So longish, longer than the more recent fare. I kind of want to get to the story after it as well, if I can. That may not be possible due to time constraints, but we'll see. How long is that one? Because the one after this is Transition Dreams, and it's kind of another interesting extra sciencey one. Yeah, that one's pretty short, like shy 20 pages, I think. Yeah, it's like 15 pages long. A lot of the stories in this one are pretty good, so I'm excited to read any and all of them. Alrighty, give me one sec to prep, and we're good. Cocoon by Greg Egan. The explosion shattered windows hundreds of meters away, but started no fire. Later, I discovered that it had shown up on a seismograph at Macquarie University, fixing the time precisely, 3:52 a.m. Residents woken up by the blast phoned emergency services within minutes, and our night shift operator called me just after 4, but there was no point rushing to the scene when I'd only be in the way. I sat at the terminal in my study for almost an hour, assembling background data and monitoring the radio traffic on headphones, drinking coffee and trying not to type too loudly. By the time I arrived, the local fire service contractors had departed, having certified that there was no risk of further explosions, but our forensic people were still poring over the wreckage, the electric hum of their equipment all but drowned out by birdsong. Lane Cove was a quiet, leafy suburb, mixed residential and high-tech industrial, the lush vegetation of corporate open spaces blending almost seamlessly into the adjacent national park, which straddled the Lane Cove River. The map of the area on my car terminal had identified suppliers of laboratory reagents and pharmaceuticals, manufacturers of precision instruments for scientific and aerospace applications, and no less than 27 biotechnology firms, including Life Enhancement International, the erstwhile sprawling concrete building now reduced to a collection of white powdery blocks clustered around twisted reinforcement rods. The exposed steel glinted in the early light, disconcertingly pristine. The building was only 3 years old. I could understand why the forensic team had ruled out an accident at their first glance. A few drums of organic solvent could not have done anything remotely like this. Nothing legally stored in a residential zone could reduce a modern building to rubble in a matter of seconds. I spotted Janet Lansing as I left my car. She was surveying the ruins with an expression of stoicism, but she was hugging herself. Mild shock, probably. She had no other reason to be chilly. It had been stinking hot all night, and the temperature was already climbing. Lansing was director of the Lane Cove Complex, 43 years old, with a PhD in molecular biology from Cambridge, and an MBA from an equally reputable Japanese virtual university. I'd had my knowledge miner extract her details, and photo, from assorted databases before I'd left home. I approached her and said, "James Glass, Nexus Investigations." She frowned at my business card, but accepted it, then glanced at the technicians trawling their gas chromatographs and holography equipment around the perimeter of the ruins. "They're yours, I suppose?" "Yes, they've been here since 4." She smirked slightly. "What happens if I give the job to someone else, and charge the lot of you with trespass?" "If you hire another company, we'll be happy to hand over all the samples and data we've collected." She nodded distractedly. "I'll hire you, of course. Since 4? I'm impressed. You've even arrived before the insurance people." As it happened, LEI's insurance people owned 49% of Nexus and would stay out of the way until we were finished, but I didn't see any reason to mention that. Lansing added sourly, "Our so-called security firm only worked up the courage to phone me half an hour ago. Evidently a fiber-optic junction box was sabotaged, disconnecting the whole area. They're supposed to send in patrols in the event of equipment failure, but evidently they didn't bother." I grimaced sympathetically. "What exactly were your people making here?" "Making? Nothing. We did no manufacturing. This was pure R&D." In fact, I'd already established that LEI's factories were all in Thailand and Indonesia, with head office in Monaco and research facilities scattered around the world. There's a fine line, though, between demonstrating that the facts are at your fingertips and unnerving the client. A total stranger ought to make at least one trivial wrong assumption, and ask at least one misguided question. I always do. "So, what were you researching and developing?" "That's commercially sensitive information." I took my notepad from my shirt pocket and displayed a standard contract, complete with the usual secrecy provisions. She glanced at it, then had her own computer scrutinize the document. Conversing in modulated infrared, the machines rapidly negotiated the fine details. My notepad signed the agreement electronically on my behalf, and Lansing's did the same. Then they both chimed happily in unison to let us know that the deal had been concluded. Lansing said, "Our main project here was engineering improved syncytotrophic trophoblastic cells." I was so close! I was so close! Damn it. Almost did it. "Our main project here was engineering improved syncytiotrophoblastic cells." I smiled patiently, and she translated for me. "Strengthening the barrier between the maternal and fetal blood supplies. Mother and fetus don't share blood directly, but they exchange nutrients and hormones across the placental barrier. The trouble is, all kinds of viruses, toxins, pharmaceuticals, and illicit drugs can also cross over. The natural barrier cells didn't evolve to cope with HIV, fetal alcohol syndrome, cocaine-addicted babies, or the next thalidomide-like disaster. We're aiming for a single intravenous injection of a gene-tailoring vector, which would trigger the formation of an extra layer of cells in the appropriate structures within the placenta, specifically designed to shield the fetal blood supply from contaminants in the maternal blood." "A thicker barrier?" "Smarter, more selective, more choosy about what it lets through. We know exactly what the developing fetus actually needs from the maternal blood. These gene-tailored cells would contain specific channels for transporting each of those substances. Nothing else would be allowed through." "Very impressive." "A cocoon around the unborn child, shielding it from all of the poisons of modern society." It sounded like exactly the kind of beneficent technology a company called Life Enhancement would be hatching in leafy Lane Cove. True, even a layman could spot a few flaws in the scheme. I'd heard that HIV most often infected children during birth itself, not pregnancy, but presumably there were other viruses which crossed the placental barrier more frequently. And I had no idea whether or not mothers at risk of giving birth to children stunted by alcohol or addicted to cocaine were likely to rush out en masse and have gene-tailored fetal barriers installed. But I could picture a strong demand from people terrified of food additives, pesticides, and pollutants. In the long term, if the system actually worked and wasn't prohibitively expensive, it could even become a part of routine prenatal care. Beneficent and lucrative. In any case, whether or not there were biological, economic, and social factors which might keep the technology from being a complete success, it was hard to imagine anyone objecting to the principle of the thing. I said, "Were you working with animals?" Lansing scowled. "Only early only early calf embryos and disembodied bovine uteruses on tissue support machines. If it was an animal rights group, they would have been better off bombing an abattoir." Hmm. In the past few years, the Sydney chapter of Animal Equality, the only group known to use such extreme methods, had concentrated on primate research facilities. They might have changed their focus or been misinformed, but LEI still seemed like an odd target. There were still plenty of laboratories widely known to use whole, live rats and rabbits as if they were disposable test tubes, many of them quite close by. What about competitors? No one else is pursuing this kind of product line, so far as I know. There's no race being run. We've already obtained individual patents for all of the essential components, the membrane channels, the transporter molecules, so any competitor would have to pay us license fees, regardless. What if someone simply wanted to damage you, financially? Then they should have bombed one of the factories instead. Cutting off our cash flow would have been the best way to hurt us. This laboratory wasn't earning a cent. Your share price will still take a dive, won't it? Nothing makes investors nervous quite so much as terrorism. Lansing agreed, reluctantly. But then, whoever took advantage of that and launched a takeover bid would suffer the same taint themselves. I don't deny that commercial sabotage takes place in this industry, now and then, but not on a level as crude as this. Genetic engineering is a subtle business. Bombs are for fanatics. Perhaps. But who would be fanatically opposed to the idea of shielding human embryos from viruses and poisons? Several religious sects flatly rejected any kind of modification to human biology, but the ones who employed violence were far more likely to have bombed a manufacturer of abortifacient drugs than a laboratory dedicated to the task of safeguarding the unborn child. Elaine Chang, head of the forensic team, approached us. I introduced her to Lansing. Elaine said, "It was a very professional job. If you'd hired demolition experts, they wouldn't have done a single thing differently. But then they probably would have used identical software to compute the timing and placement of the charges." She held up her notepad and displayed a stylized reconstruction of the building, with hypothetical explosive charges marked. She hit a button, and the simulation crumbled into something very like the actual mess behind us. She continued, "Most reputable manufacturers these days imprint every batch of explosive with a trace element signature, which remains in the residue. We've linked the charges used here to a batch stolen from a warehouse in Singapore 5 years ago." I added, "Which may not be a great help, though, I'm afraid. After 5 years on the black market, they could have changed hands a dozen times." Elaine returned to her equipment. Lansing was beginning to look a little dazed. I said, "I'd like to talk to you again, later, but I am going to need a list of your employees, past and present, as soon as possible." She nodded and hit a few keys on her notepad, the transferring the list to mine. She said, "Nothing's been lost, really. We had off-site backup for all of our data, administrative and scientific. And we have frozen samples of most of the cell lines we were working on in a vault in Milson's Point. Commercial data backup would be all but untouchable, with the records stored in a dozen or more locations scattered around the world. Heavily encrypted, of course. Cell lines sounded more vulnerable. I said, "You'd better let the vault's operators know what's happened." "I've already done that. I phoned them on my way here." She gazed at the wreckage. "The insurance company will pay for the rebuilding. In 6 months' time, we'll be back on our feet. So whoever did this was wasting their time. The work will go on." I said, "Who would want to stop it in the first place?" Lansing's faint smirk appeared again, and I very nearly asked her what she found so amusing. But people often act incongruously in the face of disasters, large or small. Nobody had died, she wasn't remotely hysterical, but it would have been strange if a setback like this hadn't knocked her slightly off kilter. She said, "You tell me. That's your job, isn't it?" Martin was in the living room when I arrived home that evening, working on his costume for the Mardi Gras. I couldn't imagine what it would look like when it was completed, but there were definitely feathers involved. Blue feathers. I did my best to appear composed, but I could tell from his expression that he'd caught an involuntary flicker of distaste on my face as he looked up. We kissed anyway, and said nothing about it. Over dinner, though, he couldn't help himself. "40th anniversary this year, James. Sure to be the biggest yet. You could at least come and watch." His eyes glinted. He enjoyed needling me. We'd had this argument 5 years running, and it was close to becoming a ritual as pointless as the parade itself. I said flatly, "Why would I want to watch 10,000 drag queens ride down Oxford Street, blowing kisses to the tourists?" "Don't exaggerate. There'll only be 1,000 men in drag at most." "Yeah, the rest will be in sequined jockstraps." "If you actually came and watched, you'd discover that most people's imaginations have progressed far beyond that." I shook my head, bemused. If people's imaginations had progressed, there'd be no gay and lesbian Mardi Gras at all. It's a freak show for people who want to live in a cultural ghetto. 40 years ago, it might have been provocative. Maybe it did some good back then. But now? What's the point? There are no laws left to change, no politics left to address. This kind of thing just recycles the same moronic stereotypes year after year. Martin said smoothly, "It's a public reassertion of the right to diverse sexuality. Just because it's no longer a protest march as well as a celebration doesn't mean it's irrelevant. And complaining about stereotypes is like complaining about the characters in a medieval morality play. The costumes are code, shorthand. Give the great unwashed heterosexual masses credit for some intelligence. They don't watch the parade and conclude that the average gay man spends all his time in a gold lame tutu. People aren't that literal-minded. They all learn semiotics in kindergarten, and they know how to decode the message." I'm sure they do, but it's still the wrong message. It makes exotic what ought to be mundane. Okay, people have the right to dress up any way they like and march down Oxford Street, but it means absolutely nothing to me. I'm not asking you to join in. Very wise. But if 100,000 straights can turn up to show their support for the gay community, why can't you? I said wearily, because every time I hear the word community, I know I'm being manipulated. If there is such a thing as the gay community, I'm certainly not a part of it. As it happens, I don't want to spend my life watching gay and lesbian television channels, using gay and lesbian news systems, or going to gay and lesbian street parades. It's also proprietary. You'd think there was a multinational corporation who had the franchise rights on homosexuality. And if you don't market the product their way, you're some kind of second class, inferior bootleg unauthorized queer." Martin cracked up. When he finally stopped laughing, he said, "Go on, I'm waiting for you to get to the part where you say that you're no more proud of being gay than you are of having brown eyes or black hair or a birthmark behind your left knee." I protested. "That's true. Why should I be proud of something I was born with? I'm not proud or ashamed. I just accept it. And I don't have to join a parade to prove that." "So you'd rather we all stayed invisible?" "Invisible? You're the one who told me that the representation rates in movies and TV last year were close to the true demographics. And you've And if you hardly even notice it anymore when an openly gay or lesbian politician gets elected, that's because it's no longer an issue. To most people, now it's about as significant as being left or right handed." Martin seemed to find this subject surreal. "Are you trying to tell me that it's now a non subject? That the inhabitants of this planet are now absolutely impartial on the question of sexual preference? Your faith is touching, but—" He mimed incredulity. I said, "We're equal before the law with any heterosexual couple, aren't we? And when was the last time you told someone you were gay and they so much as blinked? And yes, I know there are dozens of countries where it's still illegal, along with joining the wrong political parties or the wrong religions. Parades in Oxford Street aren't going to change that. People are still bashed in this city. People are still discriminated against." "Yeah, and people are also shot dead in peak hour traffic for playing the wrong music in their car stereos, or denied jobs because they live in the wrong suburbs. I'm not talking about the perfection of human nature. I just want you to acknowledge one tiny victory. Leaving out a few psychotics and a few fundamentalist bigots, most people just don't care." Martin said ruefully, "If only that were true." The argument went on for more than an hour, ending in a stalemate, as usual. But then, neither of us had seriously expected to change the other's mind. I did catch myself wondering afterward, though, if I really believed all of my own optimistic rhetoric. About as significant as being left or right handed? Certainly, that was the line taken by most Western politicians, academics, essayists, talk show hosts, soap opera writers, and mainstream religious leaders. But the same people had been espousing equally high minded principles of racial equality for decades, and the reality still hadn't entirely caught up on that front. I'd suffered very little discrimination myself. By the time I reached high school, tolerance was hip, and I'd witnessed a constant stream of improvements since then. But how could I ever know precisely how much hidden prejudice remained? By interrogating my own straight friends? By reading the sociologists' latest attitude surveys? People will always tell you what they think you want to hear. Still, it hardly seemed to matter. Personally, I could get by without the deep and sincere approval of every other member of the human race. Martin and I were lucky enough to have been born into a time and place where, in almost every tangible respect, we were treated as equal. What more could anyone hope for? In bed that night, we made love very slowly, at first just kissing and stroking each other's bodies for what seemed like hours. Neither of us spoke, and in the stupefying heat I lost all sense of belonging to any other time, any other reality. Nothing existed but the two of us. The rest of the world, the rest of my life, went spinning away into the darkness. The investigation moved slowly. I interviewed every current member of LEI's workforce, then started on the long list of past employees. I still believed that commercial sabotage was the most likely explanation for such a professional job. But blowing up the opposition is a desperate measure. A little civilized espionage usually comes first. I was hoping that someone who'd worked for LEI might have been approached in the past and offered money for inside information. And if I could find just one employee who'd turned down a bribe, they might have learned something useful from their contact with the presumed rival. Although the Lane Cove facility had only been built 3 years before, LEI had operated a research division in Sydney for 12 years before that, in North Ryde, not far away. Many of the ex-employees from that period had moved interstate or overseas. Quite a few had been transferred to LEI divisions in other countries. Still, almost no one had changed their personal phone numbers, so I had very little trouble tracking them down. The exception was a biochemist named Catherine Mendelsohn. The number listed for her in the LEI staff records had been cancelled. There were 17 people with the same surname and initials in the National Phone Directory. None admitted to being Catherine Alice Mendelsohn, and none looked at all like the staff photo I had. Mendelssohn's address in the electoral roll, an apartment in Newtown, matched the LEI records, but the same address was in the phone directory and electoral roll for Stanley Goh, a young man who told me he'd never met Mendelssohn. He'd been leasing the apartment for the last 18 months. Credit rating databases gave the same out-of-date address. I couldn't access tax, banking, or utility records without a warrant. I had my knowledge miners scan the death notices, but there was no match there. Mendelssohn had worked for LEI until about a year before the move to Lane Cove. She'd been part of a team working on a gene tailoring system for ameliorating menstrual side effects, and although the Sydney division had always specialized in gynecological research, for some reason the project was about to be moved to Texas. I checked the industry publications. Apparently, LEI had been rearranging all of its operations at the time, gathering together projects from around the globe into new multidisciplinary configurations, in accordance with the latest fashionable theories of research dynamics. Mendelssohn had declined the transfer and had been retrenched. I dug deeper. The staff records showed that Mendelssohn had been questioned by security guards after being found on the North Ryde premises late at night, 2 days before her dismissal. Workaholic biotechnologists aren't uncommon, but starting the day at 2 in the morning shows exceptional dedication, especially when the company has just tried to shuffle you off to Amarillo. Amarillo? Having turned down the transfer, she must have known what was in store. Nothing came of the incident, though, and even if Mendelssohn had been planning some minor act of sabotage, that hardly established any connection with a bombing 4 years later. She might have been angry enough to leak confidential information to one of LEI's rivals, but whoever had bombed the Lane Cove laboratory would have been more interested in someone who'd worked on the fetal barrier project itself, a project which had only come into existence a year after Mendelssohn had been sacked. I pressed on through the list. Interviewing the ex-employees was frustrating. Almost all of them were still working in the biotechnology industry, and they would have been an ideal group to poll on the question of who would benefit most from LEI's misfortune. But the confidentiality agreement I'd signed meant that I couldn't disclose anything about the research in question, not even to people working for LEI's other divisions. The one thing which I could discuss drew a blank. If anyone had been offered a bribe, they weren't talking about it, and no magistrate was going to sign a warrant letting me loose on a fishing expedition through 117 people's financial records. Forensic examination of the ruins and the sabotaged fiber optic exchange had yielded the usual catalogue of minutiae, which might eventually turn out to be invaluable, but none of it was going to conjure up a suspect out of thin air. 4 days after the bombing, just as I found myself growing desperate for a fresh angle on the case, I had a call from Janet Lansing. The backup samples of the project's gene-tailored cell lines had been destroyed. The vault in Milson's Point turned out to be directly underneath a section of the harbor bridge, built right into the foundations on the north shore. Lansing hadn't arrived yet, but the head of security for the storage company, an elderly man called David Asher, showed me around. Inside, the traffic was barely audible, but the vibration coming through the floor felt like a constant mild earthquake. The place was cavernous, dry and cool. At least 100 cryogenic freezers were laid out in rows. Heavily clad pipes ran between them, replenishing their liquid nitrogen. Asher was understandably morose, but cooperative. Celluloid movie film had been archived here, he explained, before everything went digital. The present owners specialized in biological materials. There were no guards physically assigned to the vault, but the surveillance cameras and alarm systems looked impressive, and the structure itself must have been close to impregnable. Lansing had phoned the storage company, Biophile, on the morning of the bombing. Asher confirmed that he'd sent someone down from their North Sydney office to check the freezer in question. Nothing was missing, but he promised to boost security measures immediately. Because the freezers were supposedly tamper-proof and individually locked, clients were normally allowed access to the vault at their convenience, monitored by the surveillance cameras, but otherwise unsupervised. Asher had promised Lansing that, henceforth, nobody would enter the building without a member of his staff to accompany them, and he claimed that nobody had been inside since the day of the bombing anyway. When two LEI technicians had arrived that morning to carry out an inventory, they'd found the expected number of culture flasks, all with the correct barcode labels, all tightly sealed. But the appearance of their contents was subtly wrong. The translucent frozen colloid was more opalescent than cloudy. An untrained eye might never have noticed the difference, but apparently it spoke volumes to the cognoscenti. The technicians had taken a number of the flasks away for analysis. LEI were working out of temporary premises, a subleased corner of a paint manufacturer's quality control lab. Lansing had promised me preliminary test results by the time we met. Lansing arrived and unlocked the freezer. With gloved hands, she lifted a flask out of the swirling mist and held it up for me to inspect. She said, "We've only thawed 3 samples, but they all look the same. The cells have been torn apart." "How?" The flask was covered with such heavy condensation that I couldn't have said if it was empty or full, let alone cloudy or opalescent. "It looks like radiation damage." My skin crawled. I peered into the depths of the freezer. All I could make out were the tops of rows of identical flasks. But if one of them had been spiked with a radioisotope... Lansing scowled. "Relax." She tapped a small electronic badge pinned to her lab coat, with a dull gray face like a solar cell, a radiation dosimeter. "This would be screaming if we were being exposed to anything significant. Whatever the source of the radiation was, it's no longer in here, and it hasn't left the walls glowing. Your future offspring are safe." I let that pass. "You think all the samples will turn out to be ruined? You won't be able to salvage anything?" Lansing was stoical as ever. "It looks that way. There are some elaborate techniques we could use to try to repair the DNA. But it will probably be easier to synthesize fresh DNA from scratch and reintroduce it into unmodified bovine placental cell lines. We still have all the sequence data. That's what matters in the end." I pondered the freezer's locking system, the surveillance cameras. Are you sure that the source was inside the freezer? Or could the damage have been done without actually breaking in, right through the walls? She thought it over. "Maybe. There's not much metal in these things. They're mostly plastic foam. But I'm not a radiation physicist. Your forensic people will probably be able to give you a better idea of what happened, once they've checked out the freezer itself. If there's damage to the polymers in the foam, it might be possible to use that to reconstruct the geometry of the radiation field." A forensic team was on its way. I said, "How would they have done it? Walked casually by and just... Hardly. A source which could do this in one quick hit would have been unmanageable. It's far more likely to have been a matter of weeks or months of low-level exposure. So they must have smuggled some kind of device into their own freezer and aimed it at yours? But then we'll be able to trace the effects right back to the source, won't we? So how could they have hoped to get away with it? Lansing said, "It's even simpler than that. We're talking about a modest amount of a gamma-emitting isotope, not some billion-dollar particle beam weapon. The effective range would be a couple of meters at most. If it was done from the outside, you've just narrowed down your suspect list to two." She thumped the freezer's left neighbor in the aisle, then did the same to the one on the right, and said, "Aha!" "What?" She thumped them both again. The second one sounded hollow. I said, "No liquid nitrogen? It's not in use?" Lansing nodded. She reached for the handle. Asher said, "I don't think." The freezer wasn't locked. The lid swung open easily. Lansing's badge started beeping. And worse, there was something in there with batteries and wires. I don't know what kept me from knocking her to the floor, but Lansing, untroubled, lifted the lid all the way. She said, mildly, "Don't panic. This dose rate's nothing. Threshold of detectable." The thing inside looked superficially like a homemade bomb, but the batteries and timer chip I'd glimpsed were wired to a heavy-duty solenoid, which was part of an elaborate shutter mechanism on one side of a large metallic gray box. Lansing said, "Cannibalized medical source, probably. You know these things have turned up in garbage dumps." She unpinned her badge and waved it near the box. The pitch of the alarm increased, but only slightly. "Shielding seems to be intact." I said, as calmly as possible, "These people have access to high explosive. You don't have any idea what the fuck might be in there, or what it's wired up to do. This is the point where we walk out, quietly, and leave it to the bomb disposal robots." She seemed about to protest, but then she nodded contritely. The three of us went up onto the street, and Asher called the local terrorist services contractor. I suddenly realized that they'd have to divert all traffic from the bridge. The Lane Cove bombing had received some perfunctory media coverage, but this would lead the evening news. I took Lansing aside. "They've destroyed your laboratory. They've wiped out your cell lines. Your data may be almost impossible to locate and corrupt, so the next logical target is you and your employees. Nexus don't provide protective services, but I can recommend a good firm." I gave her the phone number. She accepted it with appropriate solemnity. "So you finally believe me? These people aren't commercial saboteurs. They're dangerous fanatics." I was growing impatient with her vague references to fanatics. Who exactly do you have in mind? She said, darkly, "We're tampering with certain natural processes. You can draw your own conclusions, can't you?" There was no logic to that at all. God's image would want to force all pregnant women with HIV infections or drug habits to use the cocoon. They wouldn't try to bomb the technology out of existence. Gaia's soldiers were more concerned with genetically engineered crops and bacteria than trivial modifications to insignificant species like humans. And they wouldn't have used radioisotopes if the fate of the planet depended on it. Lansing was beginning to sound thoroughly paranoid. although in the circumstances I couldn't really blame her. I said, I'm not drawing any conclusions. I'm just advising you to take some sensible precautions, because we have no way of knowing how far this might escalate. But Biophile must lease freezer space to every one of your competitors. A commercial rival would have found it 1,000 times easier than any hypothetical sect member trying to get into the vault to plant that thing. A gray armor-plated van screeched to a halt in front of us. The back door swung up, ramps slid down, and a squat, multi-limbed robot on treads descended. I raised a hand in greeting, and the robot did the same. The operator was a friend of mine. Lansing said, You may be right, but then there's nothing to stop a terrorist from having a day job in biotechnology, is there? The device turned out not to be booby-trapped at all, just rigged to spray LEI's precious cells with gamma rays for 6 hours, starting at midnight every night. Even in the unlikely event that someone had come into the vault in the early hours and wedged themselves into the narrow gap between the freezers, the dose they received would not have been much. As Lansing had suggested, it was the cumulative effect over months that had done the damage. The radioisotope in the box was cobalt-60, almost certainly a decommissioned medical source, grown too weak for its original use, but still too hot to be discarded, stolen from a cooling-off site. No such theft had been reported, but Elaine Chang's assistants were phoning around the hospitals, trying to persuade them to re-inventory their concrete bunkers. Cobalt-60 was dangerous stuff, but 50 milligrams in a carefully shielded container wasn't exactly a tactical nuclear weapon. The news systems went berserk, though. Atomic terrorists strike harbor bridge, etc. If LEI's enemies were activists, with some moral cause which they hoped to set before the public, they clearly had the worst PR advisors in the business. Their prospects of gaining the slightest sympathy had vanished the instant the first news reports had mentioned the word radiation. My secretarial software issued polite statements of no comment on my behalf, but camera crews began hovering outside my front door, so I relented and mouthed a few newspeak sentences for them which meant essentially the same thing. Martin looked on, amused, and then I looked on, astonished, as Janet Lansing's own doorstop media conference appeared on TV. These people are clearly ruthless. Human life, the environment, radioactive contamination, all mean nothing to them.
Do you have any idea who might be responsible for this outrage, Dr. Lansing?
I can't disclose that yet. All I can reveal right now is that our research is at the very cutting edge of preventative medicine, and I'm not at all surprised that there are powerful vested interests working against us. Powerful vested interests? What was that meant to be code for, if not the rival biotechnology firm whose involvement she kept denying? No doubt she had her eye on the publicity advantages of being the victim of atomic terrorists, but I thought she was wasting her breath. In 2 or more years' time, when the product finally hit the market, the story would be long forgotten. After some tricky jurisdictional negotiations, Asher finally sent me 6 months' worth of files from the vault's surveillance cameras, all that they kept. The freezer in question had been unused for almost 2 years. The last authorized tenant was a small IVF clinic which had gone bankrupt. Only about 60% of the freezers were currently leased, so it wasn't particularly surprising that LEI had had a conveniently empty neighbor. I ran the surveillance files through image processing software in the hope that someone might have been caught in the act of opening the unused freezer. The search took almost an hour of supercomputer time, and turned up precisely nothing. A few minutes later, Elaine Chang popped her head into my office to say that she'd finished her analysis of the damage to the freezer walls. The nightly irradiation had been going on for between 8 and 9 months. Undeterred, I scanned the files again, this time instructing the software to assemble a gallery of every individual sighted inside the vault. 62 faces emerged. I put company names to all of them, matching the names of each sighting to Biofile's records of the use of each client's electronic key. No obvious inconsistencies showed up. Nobody had been seen inside who hadn't used an authorized key to gain access. And the same people had used the same keys again and again. I flicked through the gallery, wondering what to do next. Search for anyone glancing slyly in the direction of the radioactive freezer? The software could have done it, but I wasn't quite ready for barrel-scraping efforts like that. I came to a face which looked familiar, a blonde woman in her mid-30s, who'd used the key belonging to Federation Centennial Hospital's Oncology Research Unit 3 times. I was certain that I knew her, but I couldn't recall where I'd seen her before. It didn't matter. After a few seconds searching, I found a clear shot of the name badge pinned to her lab coat. All I had to do was zoom in. The badge read, C. Mendelsohn. There was a knock on my open door. I turned from the screen. Elaine was back, looking pleased with herself. She said, "We finally found a place who'll own up to having lost some Cobalt-60. What's more, the activity of our source fits their missing item's decay curve exactly." So where was it stolen from? Federation Centennial. I phoned the Oncology Research Unit. Yes, Catherine Mendelsohn worked there. She'd done so for almost 4 years. But they couldn't put me through to her. She'd been on sick leave all week. They gave me the same canceled phone number as LEI, but a different address, an apartment in Petersham. The address wasn't listed in the phone directory. I'd have to go there in person. A cancer research team would have no reason to want to harm LEI, but a commercial rival, with or without their own key to the vault, could still have paid Mendelsohn to do their work for them. It seemed like a lousy deal to me, whatever they'd offered her. If she was convicted, every last cent would be traced and confiscated. But bitterness over her sacking might have clouded her judgment. Maybe. Or maybe that was all too glib. I replayed the shots of Mendelsohn taken by the surveillance cameras. She did nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. She went straight to the ORU's freezer, put in whatever samples she'd brought, and departed. She didn't glance slyly in any direction at all. The fact that she had been inside the vault, on legitimate business, proved nothing. The fact that the Cobalt-60 had been stolen from the hospital where she worked could have been pure coincidence. And anyone had the right to cancel their phone service. I pictured the steel reinforcement rods of the Lane Cove laboratory glinting in the sunlight. On the way out, reluctantly, I took a detour to the basement. I sat at a console while the armaments safe checked my fingerprints, took breath samples and a retinal blood spectrogram, ran some perception and judgment response time tests, then quizzed me for 5 minutes about the case. Once it was satisfied with my reflexes, my motives, and my state of mind, it issued me a 9mm pistol and a shoulder holster. Mendelssohn's apartment block was a concrete box from the 1960s, front doors opening onto long shared balconies, no security at all. I arrived just after 7, to the smell of cooking and the sound of game show applause wafting from 100 open windows. The concrete still shimmered with the day's heat. 3 flights of stairs left me coated in sweat. Mendelssohn's apartment was silent, but the lights were on. She answered the door. I introduced myself and showed her my ID. She seemed nervous, but not surprised. She said, "I still find it galling to have to deal with people like you." People like, "I was opposed to privatizing the police force. I helped organize some of the marches." She would have been 14 years old at the time, a precocious political activist. She let me in, begrudgingly. The living room was modestly furnished, with a terminal on a desk in one corner. I said, "I'm investigating the bombing of Life Enhancement International. You used to work for them, up until about 4 years ago. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Can you tell me why you left?" She repeated what I knew about the transfer of her project to the Amarillo division. She answered every question directly, looking me straight in the eye. She still appeared nervous, but she seemed to be trying to read some vital piece of information from my demeanor. Wondering if I'd traced the cobalt? "What were you doing on the North Ride premises at 2 in the morning, 2 days before you were sacked?" She said, "I wanted to find out what LEI were planning for the new building. I wanted to know why they didn't want me to stick around." "Your job was moved to Texas." She laughed dryly. "The work wasn't that specialized. I could have swapped jobs with someone who wanted to travel to the States. It would have been the perfect solution, and there would have been plenty of people more than happy to trade places with me. But no, that wasn't allowed." "So, did you find the answer?" "Not that night, but later, yes." I said carefully, "So you knew what LEI were doing in Lane Cove?" "Yes." "How did you discover that?" "I kept an ear to the ground. Nobody who'd stayed on would have told me directly, but word leaked out, eventually, about a year ago." 3 years after you'd left? Why were you still interested? Did you think there was a market for the information?" She said, "Put your notepad in the bathroom sink and run the tap on it." I hesitated, then complied. When I returned to the living room, she had her face in her hands. She looked up at me grimly. Why was I still interested? Because I wanted to show why every project with any lesbian or gay team members was being transferred out of the division. I wanted to know if that was pure coincidence or not. I felt a sudden chill in the pit of my stomach. I said, if you had some problem with discrimination, there are avenues you could have." Mendelssohn shook her head impatiently. "LEI were never discriminatory. They didn't sack anyone who was willing to move. And they always transferred the entire team. There was nothing so crude as picking out individuals by sexual preference. And they had a rationalization for everything. Projects were being regrouped between divisions to facilitate synergistic cross-pollination." And if that sounds like pretentious bullshit, it was. But it was plausible pretentious bullshit. Other corporations have adopted far more ridiculous schemes, in perfect sincerity. But if it wasn't a matter of discrimination, why should LEI want to force people out of one particular division? I think I'd finally guessed the answer, even as I said those words, but I needed to hear her spell it out before I could really believe it. Mendelssohn must have been practicing her version for non-biochemists. She had it down pat. "When people are subject to stress, physical or emotional, the levels of certain substances in the bloodstream increase. Cortisol and adrenaline, mainly. Adrenaline has a rapid short-term effect on the nervous system. Cortisol works on a much longer time frame, modulating all kinds of bodily processes, adapting them for hard times, injury, fatigue, whatever. If the stress is prolonged, someone's cortisol can be elevated for days or weeks or months. High enough levels of cortisol in the bloodstream of a pregnant woman can cross the placental barrier and interact with the hormonal system of the developing fetus. There are parts of the brain where embryonic development is switched into one of two possible pathways by hormones released by the fetal testes or ovaries. The parts of the brain that control body image and the parts that control sexual preference. Female embryos usually develop a brain wired with a self-image of a female body and the strongest potential for sexual attraction toward males. Male embryos, vice versa. And it's the sex hormones in the fetal bloodstream which let the growing neurons know the gender of the embryo and which wiring to pattern to adopt. Cortisol can interfere with this process. The precise interactions are complex, but the ultimate effect depends on the timing. Different parts of the brain are switched into gender-specific versions at different stages of development. So, stress at different times during pregnancy leads to different patterns of sexual preference and body image in the child. Homosexual, bisexual, transsexual. Obviously, a lot depends on the mother's biochemistry. Pregnancy itself is stressful, but everyone responds to that differently. The first sign that cortisol might have an effect came in studies in the 1980s on the children of German women who'd been pregnant during the most intense bombing raids of World War II, when the stress was so great that the effect showed through despite individual differences. In the 90s, researchers thought they'd found a gene which determined male homosexuality, but it was always maternally inherited, and it turned out to be influencing the mother's stress response rather than acting directly on the child. If maternal cortisol and other stress hormones were kept from reaching the fetus, then the gender of the brain would always match the gender of the body in every respect. All of the present variation would be wiped out. I was shaken, but I don't think I let it show. Everything she said rang true. I didn't doubt a word of it. I'd always known that sexual preference was decided before birth. I'd known that I was gay myself by the age of 7. I'd never sought out the elaborate biological details, though, because I'd never believed that the tedious mechanics of the process could ever matter to me. What turned my blood to ice was not finally learning the neuroembryology of desire. The shock was discovering that LEI planned to reach into the womb and take control of it. I pressed on with the questioning in a kind of trance, putting my own feelings into suspended animation. I said, LEI's barrier is for filtering out viruses and toxins. You're talking about a natural substance which has been present for millions of years. LEI's barrier will keep out everything they deem non-essential. If the fetus doesn't need maternal cortisol in order to survive, if LEI don't explicitly include transporters for it, it won't get through. And I'll give you one guess what their plans are. I said, you're being paranoid. You think LEI would invest millions of dollars just to take part in a conspiracy to rid the world of homosexuals? Mendelssohn looked at me pityingly. It's not a conspiracy. It's a marketing opportunity. LEI don't give a shit about the sexual politics. They could put in cortisol transporters and sell the barrier as an antiviral, anti-drug, anti-pollution screen. Or they could leave them out and sell it as all of that, plus a means of guaranteeing a heterosexual child. Which do you think would earn the most money? That question hit a nerve. I said angrily, and you had so little faith in people's choice that you bombed the laboratory so that no one would ever have the chance to decide? Mendelssohn's expression turned stony. I did not bomb LEI or irradiate their freezer. No, we've traced their Cobalt 60 to Federation Centennial. She looked stunned for a moment, then she said, Congratulations! 6,000 other people work there, you know. I'm obviously not the only one of them who's discovered what LEI is up to. You're the only one with access to the biophile vault. What do you expect me to believe? That having learned about this project, you were going to do absolutely nothing about it? Of course not. And I still plan to publicize what they're doing. Let people know what it will mean. Try to get the issue debated before the product appears in a blaze of misinformation. You said you've known about the work for a year. Yes, and I've spent most of that time trying to verify all the facts before opening my big mouth. Nothing would have been stupider than going public with half-baked rumors. I've only told about a dozen people so far, but we're going to launch a big publicity campaign to coincide with this year's Mardi Gras. Although now, with the bombing, everything's 1,000 times more complicated. She spread her hands in a gesture of helplessness. But we still have to do what we can to try to keep the worst from happening. The worst? Separatism, paranoia, homosexuality redefined as pathological, lesbians and sympathetic straight women looking for their own technological means to guarantee the survival of the culture, while the religious far right try to prosecute them for poisoning their babies, with a substance God's been happily poisoning babies with for the last few thousand years. Sexual tourists traveling from wealthy countries where the technology is in use to poorer countries where it isn't. I was sickened by the vision she was painting, but I pushed on. These dozen friends of yours? Mendelssohn said dispassionately, Go fuck yourself. I've got nothing more to say to you. I've told you the truth. I'm not a criminal, and I think you'd better leave. I went to the bathroom and collected my notepad. In the doorway, I said, If you're not a criminal, why are you so hard to track down? Wordlessly, contemptuously, she lifted her shirt and showed me the bruises below her rib cage, fading but still an ugly sight. Whoever it was who'd beaten her, an ex-lover, I could hardly blame her for doing everything she could to avoid a repeat performance. On the stairs, I hit the replay button on my notepad. The software computed the frequency spectrum for the noise of the running water, subtracted it out of the recording, then amplified and cleaned up what remained. Every word of our conversation came through crystal clear. From my car, I phoned a surveillance firm and arranged to have Mendelssohn kept under 24-hour observation. Halfway home, I stopped in a side street and sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, unable to think, unable to move. In bed that night, I asked Martin, You're left-handed. How would you feel if no one was ever born left-handed again? It wouldn't bother me in the least. Why? You wouldn't think of it as a kind of genocide? Hardly. What's this all about? Nothing. Forget it. You're shaking. I'm cold. You don't feel cold to me. As we made love, tenderly, then savagely, I thought, this is our language. This is our dialect. Wars have been fought over less. And if this language ever dies out, a people will have vanished from the face of the earth. I knew I had to drop the case. If Mendelssohn was guilty, someone else could prove it. To go on working for LEI would destroy me. Afterward, though, that seemed like sentimental bullshit. I belonged to no tribe. Every human being possessed their own sexuality, and when they died, it died with them. If no one was ever born gay again, it made no difference to me. And if I dropped the case because I was gay, I'd be abandoning everything I'd ever believed about my own equality, my own identity. Not to mention giving LEI the chance to announce, yes, of course we hired an investigator without regard to sexual preference, but apparently there was a mistake. Staring up into the darkness, I said, Every time I hear the word community, I reach for my revolver. There was no response. Martin was fast asleep. Fast asleep. Jeez Louise. I wanted to wake him. I wanted to argue it all through, there and then. But I'd signed an agreement. I couldn't tell him a thing. So I watched him sleep, and tried to convince myself that when the truth came out, he'd understand. I phoned Janet Lansing, brought her up to date on Mendelssohn, and said coldly, "Why were you so coy? Fanatics? Powerful vested interests? Are there some words you have trouble pronouncing?" She'd clearly prepared herself for this moment. "I didn't want to plant my own ideas in your head. Later on, that might have been seen as prejudicial." Seen as prejudicial by whom? It was a rhetorical question. The media, of course. By keeping silent on the issue, she'd minimized the risk of being seen to have launched a witch hunt. Telling me to go look for homosexual terrorists might have put LEI in a very unsympathetic light. Whereas my finding Mendelssohn, for other reasons entirely, despite my ignorance, would come across as proof that the investigation had been conducted without any preconceptions. I said, "You had your suspicions, and you should have disclosed them. At the very least, you should have told me what the barrier was for." "The barrier," she said, "is for protection against viruses and toxins. But anything we do to the body has side effects. It's not my role to judge whether or not those side effects are acceptable. The regulatory authorities will insist that we publicize all of the consequences of using the product, and then the decision will be up to consumers." Very neat. The government would twist their arm, forcing them to disclose their major selling point. "And what does your market research tell you?" "That's strictly confidential." I very nearly asked her, "When exactly did you find out that I was gay? After you'd hired me, or before?" On the morning of the bombing, while I'd been assembling a dossier on Janet Lansing, had she been assembling dossiers on all the people who might have bid for the investigation? And had she found the ultimate PR advantage, the ultimate seal of impartiality, just too tempting to resist? I didn't ask. I still wanted to believe that it made no difference. She'd hired me, and I'd solve the crime like any other, and nothing else would matter. I went to the bunker where the cobalt had been stored, at the edge of the Federation Centennial's grounds. The trap door was solid, but the lock was a joke, and there was no alarm system at all. Any smart 12-year-old could have broken in. Crates full of all kinds of low-level, short-lived, radioactive waste were stacked up to the ceiling, blocking most of the light from the single bulb. It was no wonder that the theft hadn't been detected sooner. There were even cobwebs, but no mutant spiders, so far as I could see. After 5 minutes poking around, listening to my borrowed dosimetry badge adding up the exposure, I was glad to get out. Whether or not the average chest x-ray would have done 10 times more damage. Hadn't Mendelssohn realized that? How irrational people were about radiation, how much harm it would do her cause once the cobalt was discovered? Or had her own, fully informed, knowledge of the minimal risks distorted her perception? The surveillance team sent me reports daily. It was an expensive service, but LEI were paying. Mendelssohn met her friends openly, telling them all about the night I'd questioned her, warning them in outraged tones that they were almost certainly being watched. They discussed the fetal barrier, the options for legitimate opposition, the problems the bombing had caused them. I couldn't tell if the whole thing was being staged for my benefit, or if Mendelssohn was deliberately contacting only those friends who genuinely believed that she hadn't been involved. I spent most of my time checking the histories of the people she met. I could find no evidence of past violence or sabotage by any of them, let alone experience with high explosives. But then, I hadn't seriously expected to be led straight to the bomber. All I had was circumstantial evidence. All I could do was gather detail after detail and hope that the mountain of facts I was assembling would eventually reach a critical mass, or that Mendelssohn would slip up, cracking under the pressure. Weeks passed, and Mendelssohn continued to brazen it out. She even had pamphlets printed, ready to distribute at the Mardi Gras, condemning the bombing as loudly as they condemned LEI for its secrecy. The nights grew hotter. My temper frayed. I don't know what Martin thought was happening to me, but I had no idea how we were going to survive the impending revelations. I couldn't begin to face up to the magnitude of the backlash there'd be once atomic terrorists met gay baby poisoners in the Daily Murdochs. And it would make no difference whether it was Mendelssohn's arrest which broke the news to the public, or her media conference blowing the whistle on LEI and proclaiming her own innocence. Either way, the investigation would become a circus. I tried not to think about any of it. It was too late to do anything differently, to drop the case, to tell Martin the truth. So I worked on my tunnel vision. Elaine scoured the radioactive waste bunker for evidence, but weeks of analysis came up blank. I quizzed the biophile guards, who, supposedly, would have been watching the whole thing on their monitors when the cobalt was planted, but nobody could recall a client with an unusually large and oddly shaped item wandering casually into the wrong aisle. I finally obtained the warrants I needed to scrutinize Mendelssohn's entire electronic history since birth. She'd been arrested exactly once, 20 years before, for kicking an unprivatized policeman in the shin during a protest he'd probably, privately, applauded. The charges had been dropped. She'd had a court order in force for the last 18 months, restraining a former lover from coming within a kilometer of her home. The woman was a musician with a band called Tetanus Switchblade. She had 2 convictions for assault. There was no evidence of undeclared income or unusual expenditure. No phone calls to or from known or suspected dealers in arms or explosives, or their known or suspected associates. But everything could have been done with payphones and cash, if she'd organized it carefully. Ha, that's dating it. Payphones? What are those? Mendelssohn wasn't going to put a foot wrong while I was watching. However careful she'd been, though, she could not have carried out the bombing alone. What I needed was someone venal, nervous, or conscience-stricken enough to turn informant. I put out the word on the usual channels. I'd be willing to pay. I'd be willing to bargain. 6 weeks after the bombing, I received an anonymous message by email. Be at the Mardi Gras. No wires, no weapons. I'll find you. 29:17:5:31:23:11. 29:17:5:31:23:11. I played with the numbers for more than an hour, trying to make sense of them, before I finally showed them to Elaine. She said, "Be careful, James." "Why?" "These are the ratios of the 6 trace elements we found in the residue from the explosion." Martin spent the day of the Mardi Gras with friends who'd also be in the parade. I sat in my air-conditioned office and tuned in to a TV channel which showed the final preparations, interspersed with talking heads describing the history of the event. In 40 years, the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras had been transformed from a series of ugly confrontations with police and local authorities into a money-spinning spectacle advertised in tourist brochures around the world. It was blessed by every level of government, led by politicians and business identities, and the police, like most professions, now had their own float. Martin was no transvestite, or muscle-bound leather fetishist, or any other walking cliché. Dressing up in flamboyant costume one night a year was as false, as artificial for him as it would have been for most heterosexual men. But I think I understood why he did it. He felt guilty that he could pass for straight in the clothes he usually wore, with the speech and manner and bearing which came naturally to him. He never concealed his sexuality from anyone, but it wasn't instantly apparent to total strangers. For him, taking part in the Mardi Gras was a gesture of solidarity with those gay men who were visible, obvious all year round, and who'd borne the brunt of the intolerance because of it. As dusk fell, spectators began to gather along the route. Helicopters from every news service appeared overhead, turning their cameras on each other to prove to their viewers that this was an event. Mounted crowd control personnel, in something very much like the old blue uniform which had vanished when I was a child, parked their horses by the fast food stands and stood around fortifying themselves for the long night ahead. I didn't see how the bomber could seriously expect to find me once I was mingling with 100,000 other people. So, after leaving the Nexus building, I drove my car around the block slowly, 3 times, just in case. By the time I'd made my way to a vantage point, I'd missed the start of the parade. The first thing I saw was a long line of people wearing giant plastic heads bearing the features of famous and infamous queers. Apparently the word was back in fashion again, officially declared non-pejorative once more, after several years out of favor. It was all so Disney I could have gagged. And yes, there was even Bernadette, the world's first lesbian cartoon mouse. I only recognized 3 of the humans portrayed: Patrick White, looking haggard and suitably bemused, Joe Orton leering sardonically, and J. Edgar Hoover with a Mephistophelian sneer. Everyone wore their names on sashes, though, for what that was worth. A young man beside me asked his girlfriend, "Who the hell was Walt Whitman?" She shook her head. "No idea. Alan Turing?" "Search me." They photographed both of them, anyway. I wanted to yell at the marchers. So what? Some queers were famous. Some famous people were queer. What a surprise! Do you think that means you own them? I kept silent, of course, while everyone around me cheered and clapped. I wondered how close the bomber was, how long he or she would leave me sweating. Panopticon, the surveillance contractors, were still following Mendelssohn and all of her known associates, most of whom were somewhere along the route of the parade, handing out their pamphlets. None of them appeared to have followed me, though. The bomber was almost certainly someone outside the network of friends we'd uncovered. An antiviral, anti-drug, anti-pollution barrier alone, or a means of guaranteeing a heterosexual child. Which do you think would earn the most money? Surrounded by cheering spectators, half of them mixed-sex couples with children in tow, it was almost possible to laugh off Mendelssohn's fears. Who, here, would admit that they'd buy a version of the Cocoon which would help wipe out the source of their entertainment? But applauding the freak show didn't mean wanting your own flesh and blood to join it. An hour after the parade had started, I decided to move out of the densest part of the crowd. If the bomber couldn't reach me through the crush of people, there wasn't much point being here. 100 or so leather-clad women on noise-enhanced electric motorbikes went riding past in crucifix formation, behind a banner which read, "Dykes on Bikes for Jesus." I recalled the small group of fundamentalists I'd passed earlier, their backs to the parade route lest they turn into pillars of salt, holding up candles and praying for rain. I made my way to one of the food stalls and bought a cold hot dog and a warm orange juice, trying to ignore the smell of horse turds. The place seemed to attract law enforcement types. J. Edgar Hoover himself came wandering by while I was eating, looking like a malevolent Humpty Dumpty. As he passed me, he said, 29, 17, 5. I finished my hot dog and followed him. He stopped in a deserted side street, behind a supermarket parking lot. As I caught up with him, he took out a magnetic scanner. I said, "No wires, no weapons." He waved the device over me. I was telling the truth. Can you talk through that thing?
Yes.
The giant head bobbed strangely. I couldn't see any eye holes, but he clearly wasn't blind. Okay. Where did the explosives come from? We know they started off in Singapore, but who is your supplier here? Hoover laughed, deep and muffled.
I'm not going to tell you that. I'd be dead in a week.
So what do you want to tell me?
That I only did the grunt work. Mendelsohn organized everything.
No shit. But what have you got that will prove it? Phone calls? Financial transactions? He just laughed again. I was beginning to wonder how many people in the parade would know who'd played J. Edgar Hoover. Even if he clammed up now, it was possible that I'd be able to track him down later. That was when I turned and saw 6 more identical Hoovers coming around the corner. They were all carrying baseball bats. I started to move. Hoover 1 drew a pistol and aimed it at my face. He said,
Kneel down slowly with your hands behind your head.
I did it. He kept the gun on me, and I kept my eyes on the trigger, but I heard the others arrive and close into a half circle behind me. Hoover 1 said,
Don't you know what happens to traitors? Don't you know what's going to happen to you?
I shook my head slowly. I didn't know what I could say to appease him, so I spoke the truth. How can I be a traitor? What is there to betray? Dykes on bikes for Jesus? The William S. Burroughs dancers? Someone behind me swung their bat into the small of my back. Not as hard as they might have. I lurched forward, but I kept my balance.
Hoover 1 said, Don't you know any history, Mr. Pig? Mr. Polizei? The Nazis put us in their death camps. The Reaganites tried to have us all die of AIDS. And here you are now, Mr. Pig, working for the fuckers who want to wipe us off the face of the planet. That sounds like betrayal to me.
I knelt there, staring at the gun, unable to speak. I couldn't dredge up the words to justify myself. The truth was too difficult, too gray, too confusing. My teeth started chattering. Nazis, AIDS, genocide. Maybe he was right. Maybe I deserved to die. I felt tears on my cheeks. Hoover 1 laughed.
Boo-hoo, Mr. Pig.
Someone swung their bat into my shoulders. I fell forward on my face, too afraid to move my hands to break the fall. I tried to get up, but a boot came down on the small of my neck, on the back of my neck. Hoover 1 bent down and put the gun to my skull. He whispered,
Will you close the case? Lose the evidence on Catherine? You know, your boyfriend frequents some dangerous places. He needs all the friends he can get.
I lifted my face high enough above the asphalt to reply, Yes.
Well done, Mr. Pig.
That was when I heard the helicopter. I blinked the gravel out of my eyes and saw the ground, far brighter than it should have been. There was a spotlight trained on us. I waited for the sound of a bullhorn. Nothing happened. I waited for my assailants to flee. Hoover 1 took his foot off my neck. And then they all laid into me with their baseball bats. I should have curled up and protected my head, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned and stole a glimpse of the chopper. It was a news crew, of course, refusing to do anything unethical like spoil a good story just when it was getting telegenic. That made perfect sense. But the goon squad made no sense at all. Why were they sticking around? Just for the pleasure of beating me for a few seconds longer? Nobody was that stupid, that oblivious to PR. I coughed up 2 teeth and hid my face again. They wanted it to be broadcast. They wanted the headlines, the backlash, the outrage. Atomic terrorists, baby poisoners, brutal thugs. They wanted to demonize the enemy they were pretending to be. The Hoovers finally dropped their bats and started running. I lay on the ground, drooling blood, too weak to lift my head to see what had driven them away. A while later, I heard hoofbeats. Someone dropped to the ground beside me and checked my pulse. I said, "I'm not in pain. I'm happy. I'm delirious." Then I passed out. On his second visit, Martin brought Catherine Mendelssohn to the hospital with him. They showed me a recording of LEI's media conference the day after the Mardi Gras, 2 hours before Mendelssohn's was scheduled to take place. Janet Lansing said, "In the light of recent events, we have no choice but to go public. We would have preferred to keep this technology under wraps for commercial reasons, but innocent lives are at stake. And when people turn on their own kind..." I burst the stitches in my lips, laughing. LEI had bombed their own laboratory. They'd irradiated their own cells. And they'd hoped that I'd cover up for Mendelssohn once the evidence led me to her, out of sympathy with her cause. Later, with a tip-off to an investigative reporter or two, the cover-up would have been revealed. The perfect climate for their product launch. Since I'd continued with the investigation, though, they'd had to make the best of it, sending in the Hoovers, claiming to be linked to Mendelssohn, to punish me for my diligence. Mendelssohn said, "Everything LEI leaked about me, the cobalt, my key to the vault, was already spelled out in the pamphlets I had printed. But that doesn't seem to cut much ice with the Murdochs. I'm the Harbor Bridge Gamma Ray terrorist now. You'll never be charged." "Of course not, so I'll never be found innocent." I said, "When I'm out of here, I'm going after them." They wanted impartiality, an investigation untainted by prejudice. They'd get exactly what they paid for this time, minus the tunnel vision. Martin said softly, "Who's going to employ you to do that?" I smiled painfully. "LEI's insurance company." When they'd left, I dozed off. I woke suddenly from a dream of suffocation. Even if I proved that the whole thing had been a marketing exercise by LEI, even if half their directors were thrown in prison, even if the company itself was liquidated, the technology would still be owned by someone. And, one way or another, in the end, it would be sold. That's what I'd missed in my fanatical neutrality. You can't sell a cure without a disease. So even if I was right to be neutral, even if there was no difference to fight for, no difference to betray, no difference to preserve, the best way to sell the cocoon would always be to invent one. And even if it would be no tragedy at all if there was nothing left but heterosexuality in a century's time, the only path which could lead there would be one of lies and wounding and vilification. Would people buy that or not? I was suddenly very much afraid that they would. And that was Cocoon by Greg Egan. All right. Pretty heavy. Pretty heavy stuff dealing with the nature of bigotry in the human condition. That is why we like stuff like this, is because it is heady. It makes us think. Um, Actually, I do have a little time. If I recall correctly, Transition Dreams is kind of creepy. Like Very Philip K. Dick, if memory serves. I also don't think I can. Well, you know what? Let me just restock on water real quick, and we will do Transition Dreams as well. Because the last couple have been really short, and I want to do a longer one that's a bit meatier. So give me one sec. I will be right back. Alrighty, and we're back. To more Luminous by Greg Egan, the short story collection. So now we're going to do Transition Dreams, which is, there's a certain degree of transhumanism here, if you know what that is. Let me just get this. Bookmark. Implanted. Where I want it implanted. Which is at the end of the story, so I have some idea of how far along I am. It's sure a handy to have a benchmark. Oh shoot. And then, actually that's a fairly long one. The one after it is another like 30, 40 pager. And then it's Reasons to be Cheerful. And Reasons to be Cheerful is really heavy. Uh, it's really good. It's, I think, probably one of my favorites in this particular collection. Actually, that one's shorter than the next one along. And then there's Our Lady of Chernobyl. Some really good short stories in this one. Um, and I think it ends with the one about uh, basically falling into a black hole. Yeah, the plank dive. Planck after the is he a mathematician or physicist? Can't remember his first name. Righty. Ooh, one sec. Something caught in my throat. Okay, there we go. Transition Dreams by Greg Egan. We can't tell you what your own transition dreams will be. The only thing that's certain is that you won't remember them. Carolyn Bosch smiles reassuringly. Bausch, sorry, B-A-U-S-C-H, Bausch. Smiles reassuringly. Her office, on the 64th floor of the Gleisner Tower, is so stylish it hurts. Her desk is an obsidian ellipse supported by 3 perspex circles, and the walls are decorated with the latest in Euclidean monochrome. But she's not at all the kind of robot the cool, geometric decor seems to demand. I have no doubt that the contrast is intentional, and that her face has been carefully designed to appear more disarmingly natural than even the most cynical person could believe was due to pure guile on the part of her employers. A few forgettable dreams? That sounds innocuous enough. I very nearly let the matter rest, but I'm puzzled. I'll be close to 0 degrees when I'm scanned, won't I? Yes, a little below, in fact. Pumped full of antifreeze disaccharides, all your fluids cooled down into a sugary glass. There's a prickling sensation on my scalp at these words, but the rush I feel is anticipation, not fear. The thought of my body as a kind of ice confectionery sculpture doesn't seem threatening at all. Several elegant blown glass figurines decorate the bookshelf behind Bausch's desk. Not only does that halt all metabolic processes, it sharpens the NMR spectra. To measure the strength of each synapse accurately, we have to be able to distinguish between subtle variations in neurotransmitter receptor types, among other things. The less thermal noise, the better. I understand, but if my brain has been shut down by hypothermia, why will I dream? Your brain won't do the dreaming. The software model we're creating will. But as I said, you won't remember any of it. In the end, the software will be a perfect copy of your deeply comatose organic brain, and it will wake from that coma remembering exactly what the organic brain experienced before the scan. No more, no less. And since the organic brain certainly won't have experienced the transition dreams, the software will have no memory of them. The software? I'd expected a simple biological explanation, a side effect of the anesthetic or the antifreeze, neurons firing off a few faint, random signals as they surrendered to the cold. Why program the robot's brain to have dreams it won't remember? We don't, or at least not explicitly. Bausch smiles her too human smile again, not quite masking an appraising glance, a moment spent deciding, perhaps, how much I really need to be told. Or perhaps the whole routine is more calculated reassurance. Look, even though I'm a robot, you can read me like a book. She says, why are Gleisner robots conscious? For the same reason humans are conscious. I've been waiting for that question since the interview began. Bausch is a counselor as much as a salesperson, and it's part of her job to ensure that I'm at ease with the new mode of existence I'm buying. Don't ask me which neural structures are involved, but whatever they are, they must be captured in the scan and recreated in the model, along with everything else. Gleisner robots are conscious because they process information about the world and about themselves in exactly the same way as humans do. So you're happy with the notion that a computer program which simulates a conscious human brain is, itself, conscious in the very same fashion? Of course. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. I wouldn't be talking to you, would I? I see no need to elaborate. To confess, I've become 1,000 times more comfortable with the whole idea ever since the 10-ton supercomputers in the basements of Dallas and Tokyo began to give way to the ambulatory Gleisner robots with their compact processors and lifelike bodies. When copies were finally, and that's with a capital C, copies, when copies were finally liberated from their virtual realities, however grand, however detailed they might have been, and given the chance to inhabit the world in the manner of flesh and blood people, I finally stopped thinking of being scanned as a fate akin to being buried alive. Bausch says, then you accept that all it takes to generate experience is to carry out is to carry out computations on data structures which encode the same information as the structures of the brain? The jargon sounds gratuitous to me, and I don't understand why she's laboring the point, but I say blandly, of course I accept that. Then think about what it implies, because the whole process of creating the finished piece of software which runs a Gleisner robot, the perfect copy of the unconscious person who is scanned, is one long sequence of computations on data structures which represent the human brain. I absorb that in silence. Bausch continues. We don't set out to cause the transition dreams, but they're probably unavoidable. Copies have to be made somehow. They can't spring into existence fully formed. The scanner has to probe the organic brain, measure the NMR spectra for billions of different cross sections, and then process those measurements into a high resolution anatomical and biochemical map. In other words, carry out several trillion computations on a vast set of data which represents the brain. Then, that map has to be used to construct the working computer model, the copy itself. More computation. More computation. I think I almost grasp what she's saying, but part of me flatly refuses to accept the notion that merely imaging the brain in high enough resolution could cause the image itself to dream. I say, none of that computation sets out to mimic the workings of the brain, though, does it? It's all just preparing the way for a program which will be conscious when it's finally up and running. Yes, and once that program is up and running, what will it do in order to be conscious? It will generate a sequence of changes in a digital representation of the brain, changes which mimic normal neural activity. But creating that representation in the first place also involves a sequence of changes. You can't go from a blank computer memory to a detailed simulation of a specific human brain without a few trillion intermediate stages, most of which will represent, in part or in full, in one form or another, possible states of the very same brain. But why should that add up to any kind of mental activity? Rearranging the data for other reasons entirely? Bausch is adamant. Reasons don't come into it. The living brain reorganizing memories is enough to give rise to ordinary dreams. And just poking an electrode into the temporal lobes is enough to generate mental activity. I know. What the brain does is so complex that it's bizarre to think of achieving the same results unintentionally. But all of the brain's complexity is coded into its structure. Once you're dealing with that structure, you're dealing with the stuff of consciousness, like it or not. That does make a certain amount of sense. Almost anything that happens to the brain feels like something. It doesn't have to be the orderly process of waking thought. If the random effects of drugs or illness can give rise to distinctive mental events, a fever dream, a schizophrenic episode, an LSD trip, why shouldn't a copy's elaborate genesis do the same? Each incomplete NMR map, each unfinished version of the simulation software, has no way of knowing that it's not yet meant to be self-aware. Still, how can you be sure of any of this if nobody remembers the dreams? The mathematics of consciousness is still in its infancy, but everything we know strongly suggests that the act of constructing a copy has subjective content, even though no trace of the experience remains. I'm still not entirely convinced, but I suppose I'll have to take her word for it. The Gleisner Corporation has no reason to invent non-existent side effects, and I'm suitably impressed that they bother to warn their customers about transition dreams at all. So far as I know, the older companies, the scanning clinics founded in the days when copies had no physical bodies, never even raised the issue. We should move on, there are other matters to discuss, but it's hard to drag my thoughts away from this unsettling revelation. I say, if you know enough to be certain that there'll always be transition dreams, can't you stretch the mathematics a little further and tell me what my dreams will be? Bausch asks innocently, How could we do that? I don't know. Examine my brain, then run some kind of simulation of the copying process. I catch myself. Ah, but how do you simulate a computation without doing it? Exactly. The distinction is meaningless. Any program which could reliably predict the content of the dreams would, itself, experience them as fully as the you of the transition process. So, what would be the point? If the dreams turned out to be unpleasant, it would be too late to spare yourself the trauma. Trauma? I'm beginning to wish I'd been satisfied with a reassuring smile and the promise of perfect amnesia. A few forgettable dreams. Now that I vaguely understand the reasons for the effect, though, it's 1,000 times harder to accept it as inevitable. Neural spasms at the onset of hypothermia might be unavoidable, but anything taking place inside a computer is supposed to be subject to limitless control. But anything taking place inside a computer is supposed to be subject to limitless control. Couldn't you monitor the dreams as they're happening and intervene if need be? I'm afraid not. But think about it. It would be like prediction, only worse. Monitoring the dreams would mean duplicating the brain like data structures in still more forms, generating more dreams in the process. So even if we could take charge of the original dreams, deciphering them and controlling them, all of the software which did that would need other software watching it to see what the side effects of its computations were, and so on. There'd be no end to it. As it is, the copy is constructed by the shortest possible process, the most direct route. The last thing you'd want to do is bring in more computing power, more elaborate algorithms, more and more systems mirroring the arithmetic of the experience. I shift in my chair, trying to shake off a growing sense of lightheadedness. The more I ask, the more surreal the whole subject becomes. But I can't seem to keep my mouth shut. If you can't say what the dreams will be about, and you can't control them, can't you at least tell me how long they'll last, subjectively? Not without running a program which also dreams the dreams. Bausch is apologetic, but I have a feeling that she finds something elegant, even proper, in this state of affairs. That's the nature of the mathematics. There are no shortcuts, no answers to hypothetical questions. We can't say for certain what any given conscious system will experience, without creating that conscious system in the process of answering the question. I laugh weakly. Images of the brain which dream, predictions of dreams which dream, dreams which infect any machine which tries to shape them. I thought that all the giddy metaphysics of virtual existence had been banished, now that it was possible to choose to be a copy living wholly in the physical world. I'd hoped to be able to step from my body into a Gleisner robot without missing a beat. And, in retrospect, of course, I will have done just that. Once I've crossed the gulf between human and machine, it will vanish seamlessly behind me. I say, so the dreams are unknowable and unavoidable? That's close to a mathematical certainty? Yes, but it's equally certain that I won't remember them? Yes. You don't recall anything about your own? Not a single mood? Not a single image? Bausch smiles tolerantly. Of course not. I woke from a simulated coma. The last thing I remember was being anesthetized before the scan. There are no buried traces, no hidden memories, no invisible scars. There can't be. In a very real sense, I never had the transition dreams at all. I finally cite a target for my frustration. Then why warn me? Why tell me about an experience I'm guaranteed to forget? Guaranteed to end up not having been through? Don't you think it would have been kinder to say nothing? Bausch hesitates. For the first time, I appear to have discomfited her, and it's a very convincing act. But she must have been asked the same question 1,000 times before. She says, when you're dreaming the transition dreams, knowing what you're going through and why might make all the difference. Knowing that it's not real. knowing that it won't last.
Perhaps.
It's not that simple, though, and she knows it. When my new mind is being pieced together, do you have any idea when this knowledge will be part of it? Can you promise me that I'll remember these comforting facts when I need them? Can you guarantee that anything you've told me will even make sense? No, but then what's the point? She says, do you think that if we'd kept silent, you would have had any chance of all of dreaming the truth? And if that entire section hasn't made you go running for the hills front right now, we're going to carry on. Because that's some metaphysical gobbledygook right there. There's a lot to dissect there, and we're not going to do it on this stream. Out on the street, in the winter sunshine, I try to put my doubts behind me. George Street is still littered with colored paper from last night's celebrations. After 6 years of bloodshed, bombings and sieges, plagues and famines, the Chinese Civil War finally seems to be over. I feel a surge of elation just looking down at the tattered remnants of the streamers and reminding myself of the glorious news. I hug myself and head for Town Hall Station. Sydney is going through its coldest June in years, with clear skies bringing sub-zero nights, and frosts lasting long into the mornings. I try to picture myself as a Gleisner robot, striding along the very same route, but choosing not to feel the bite of the wind. It's a cheerful prospect, and I'll be untroubled by anything so tedious as the swelling around my artificial knee and hip joints once I'm wholly and harmoniously artificial. Unafraid of influenza, pneumonia, or the latest wave of drug resistant diphtheria sweeping the globe. I can hardly believe that I've finally signed the contracts and set the machinery in motion, after so many years of making excuses and putting it off. Shaken out of my complacency by a string of near misses, bronchitis, a kidney infection, a melanoma on the sole of my right foot. The cytokine injections don't get my immune system humming the way they did 20 years ago. 107 this August. The number sounds surreal. But then, so did 27, so did 43, so did 61. On the train, I examined my qualms one more time, hoping to lay them to rest. Transition dreams are impossible to avoid, or predict, or control, just like ordinary dreams. They'll have a radically different origin, but there's no reason to believe that a different means of invoking the contents of my scrambled brain will give rise to an experience any more disturbing than anything I've already been through. What horrors do I think are locked up in my skull, waiting to run amok in the data stream from comatose human to comatose machine? I've suffered occasional nightmares, and a few have been deeply distressing at the time, but even as a child, I never feared sleep. So why should I fear the transition? Alice is in the garden, picking string beans, as I come over the hill from Meadowbank Station. She straightens up and waves to me. I can never quite believe the size of our vegetable patch, so close to the city. We kiss and walk inside together. Did you book the scan? Yes, 10th of July. It should sound matter of fact, like that. Of all the operations I've had in the last 10 years, this will be the safest. I start making coffee. I need something to warm me. The kitchen is luminous with sunlight, but it's colder indoors than out. And they answered all your questions? You're happy now? I suppose so. There's no point keeping it to myself, though. I tell her about the transition dreams. She says, I love the first few seconds after waking from a dream, when the whole thing's still fresh in your mind, but you can finally put it in context, when you know exactly what you've been through. You mean the relief of discovering that none of it was real? You didn't actually slaughter 100 people in a shopping arcade? Stark naked? The police aren't closing in on you after all? It works the other way, too. Though. Beautiful delusions turning to dust. She snorts. Anything that turns to dust that easily is no great loss. I pour coffee for both of us. Alice muses. Transition dreams must have strange endings, though. If you know nothing about them before they start, and nothing again by the time they finish. She stirs her coffee, and I watch the liquid sloshing from rim to rim. How would time pass in a dream like that? It can't run straight through, can it? The closer the computers came to reconstructing every detail of the comatose brain, the less room there'd be for spurious information. At the very beginning, though, there wouldn't be any information at all. Somewhere in the middle, there'd be the most leeway for memories of the dreams. So maybe time would flow in from the start and the finish, and the dream would seem to end in the middle. What do you think? I shake my head. I can't even imagine what that would be like. Maybe there are two separate dreams, one running forward, one running backward. She frowns. But if they met in the middle, they'd both have to end the same way. How could two different dreams have exactly the same ending, right down to the same memories of everything which happened before? And then there's the scanner building up its map of the brain, and the second stage transforming that map into the copy. Two cycles, two dreams, or four? Or do you think they'd all be woven together? I say irritably, I really don't care. I'm going to wake up inside a Gleisner robot, and it will all be academic. I won't have dreamed any dreams at all. Alice looks dubious. You're talking about thoughts and feelings, as real as anything the copy will feel. How can that be academic? I'm talking about a lot of arithmetic. And when you add up everything it does to me, it will all cancel out in the end. Comatose human to comatose machine. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Words just come out of her mouth sometimes. Fragments of nursery rhymes, lines from old songs. She has no say in it. The hairs stand up on my arms, though. I look down at my withered fingers, my scrawny wrists. This isn't me. Aging feels like a mistake, a detour, a misadventure. When I was 20 years old, I was immortal, wasn't I? It's not too late to find my way back. Alice murmurs, I'm sorry. I look up at her. Let's not make a big deal of this. It's time for me to become a machine, and all I have to do is close my eyes and step across the gap. Then, in a few years, it'll be your turn. We can do this. There's nothing to stop us. It's the easiest thing in the world. I reach across the table and take her hand. When I touch her, I realize I'm shivering with cold. She says, There, there. I can't sleep. Two dreams? Four dreams? Meeting in the middle? Merging into one? How will I know when they're finally over? The Gleisner robot will emerge from its coma and blithely carry on, but without a chance to look back on the transition dreams and recognize them for what they were, how will I ever put them in their place? I stare up at the ceiling. This is insane. I must have had 1,000 dreams which I've failed to remember on waking. Gone now, forever, as surely as if my amnesia was computer controlled and guaranteed. Does it matter if I was terrified of some ludicrous dream apparition, or believed I'd committed some unspeakable crime? And now I'll never have the chance to laugh off those delusions? I climb out of bed, and once I'm up, I have no choice but to dress fully to keep from freezing. Moonlight fills the room. I have no trouble seeing what I'm doing. Alice turns over in her sleep and sighs. Watching her, a wave of tenderness sweeps through me. At least I'm going first. At least I'll be able to reassure her that there's nothing to fear. In the kitchen, I find I'm not hungry or thirsty at all. I pace to keep warm. What am I afraid of? It's not as if the dreams were a barrier to be surmounted, a test I might fail, an ordeal I might not survive. The whole transition process will be predetermined, and it will carry me safely into my new incarnation. Even if I dream some laborious metaphor for my arduous journey from human to machine, trekking barefoot across an endless plain of burning coals, struggling through a blizzard toward the summit of an unclimbable mountain, and even if I fail to complete that journey, the computers will grind on, the Gleisner robot will wake, regardless. I need to get out of the house. I leave quietly, heading for the 24-hour supermarket opposite the railway station. The stars are mercilessly sharp. The air is still. If I'm colder than I was by day, I'm too numb to tell the difference. There's no traffic at all, no lights in any of the houses. It must be almost 3. I haven't been out this late in decades. The gray tones of suburban lawns by moonlight look perfectly familiar, though. When I was 17, I seemed to spend half my life talking with friends into the early morning, then trudging home through empty streets exactly like these. The supermarket's windows glow blue-white around the warmer tones of the advertising signs embedded within them. I enter the building and explore the deserted aisles. Nothing tempts me, but I feel an absurd pang of guilt about leaving empty-handed, so I grab a carton of milk. A middle-aged man tinkering with one of the advertising holograms nods at me as I carry my purchase through the exit gate, magnetic fields sensing and recording the transaction. The man says, "Good news about the war?" "Yes, it's wonderful." I start to turn away. He seems disappointed. "You don't remember me, do you?" I pause and examine him more carefully. He's balding, brown-eyed, kindly looking. "I'm sorry. I used to own this shop when you were a boy. I remember you coming in, buying things for your mother. I sold up and left town 85 years ago, but now I'm back and I've bought the old place again." I nod and smile, although I still don't recognize him. He says, "I was in a virtual city for a while. There was a tower which went all the way to the moon. I climbed the stairs to the moon." I picture a crystalline spiral staircase sweeping up through the blackness of space. "You came out, though, back into the world." "I always wanted to run the old place again." I think I remember his face now, although his name still eludes me, if I ever knew it. I can't help asking, before you were scanned, did they warn you about something called transition dreams? He smiles, as if I'd spoken the name of a mutual friend. "No, not then. But later I heard. You know, the copies used to flow from machine to machine. As the demand for computing power went up and down and exchange rates shifted, the management software used to take us apart and move us. From Japan to California to Texas to Switzerland. It would break us down into a billion data packets and send us through the network by 1,000 different routes, and then put us back together again. 10 times a day, some days." My skin crawls. And the same thing happened? Transition dreams? "That's what I heard. We couldn't even tell that we'd been shipped across the planet. It felt to us like no time had passed at all. But I heard rumors that the mathematicians had proved that there were dreams in the data at every stage. In the copy left behind as they erased it. In the copy being pieced together at the new destination. Those copies had no way of knowing that they were only intermediate steps in the process of moving a frozen snapshot from one place to another, and the changes being made to their digitized brains weren't supposed to mean anything at all." "So, did you stop it happening once you found out?" He chuckles. "No, there would have been no point, because even in the one computer, copies were moved all the time, relocated, shuffled from place to place, to allow memory to be reclaimed and consolidated, hundreds of times a second." My blood turns to ice. No wonder the old companies never raised the subject of transition dreams. I was wiser than I ever knew to wait for the Gleisner robots. Merely shifting a copy around in memory could hardly be comparable to mapping every synapse in a human brain. The dreams it generated would have to be far shorter, far simpler. But just knowing that my life was peppered with tiny mental detours, eddies of consciousness in the wake of every move, would still have been too much to bear. I head home, clutching the milk carton awkwardly with the cold arthritic fingers. As I come over the hill, I see the light on above our front door, although I'm certain that I left the house in darkness. Alice must have woken and found me missing. I wince at my thoughtlessness. I should have stayed in, or written her a note. I quicken my step. 50 meters from home, a tendril of pain flickers across my chest. I look down stupidly to see if I've walked into a protruding branch. There's nothing, but the pain returns, solid as an arrow through the flesh now, and I sink to my knees. The bracelet on my left wrist chimes softly to tell me that it's calling for help. I'm so close to my own front door, though, that I can't resist the urge to rise to my feet and see if I can make the distance. After 2 steps, the blood rushes from my head, and I fall again. I crush the milk carton against my chest, spilling the cold liquid, freezing my fingers. I can hear the ambulance in the distance. I know I should relax and keep still, but something compels me to move. I crawl towards the light. The orderly pushing me looks like he's The orderly pushing me looks like he's just decided that this is the last place on earth he'd choose to be. I silently concur and tip my head back to escape his fixed grimace, but then the sight of the ceiling going by above me is even more disconcerting. The corridor's lighting panels are so similar, and their spacing so regular, that I feel like I'm being wheeled around in a circle. I say, "Where's Alice, my wife?"
No visitors now. There'll be time for that later.
"I've paid for a scan, with the Gleisner people. If I'm in any danger, they should be told." All of this is encoded in my bracelet, though. The computers will have read it. There's nothing to fret about. The prospect of having to confront the transition in a matter of hours or minutes fills me with claustrophobic dread. But better that than having left the arrangements too late. The orderly says,
I think you're wrong about that.
"What?" I struggle to get him in sight again. He's grinning nastily, like a nightclub bouncer who's just spotted someone with the wrong kind of shoes.
I said I think you're mistaken. Our records don't mention any payment for a scan.
I break into a sweat of indignation. I signed the contracts today.
Yeah.
He reaches into a pocket and pulls out a handful of long cotton bandages, then proceeds to stuff them into my mouth. My arms are strapped to my sides. All I can do is grunt in protest and gag on cotton and saliva. Someone steps in front of the trolley and keeps pace with us, whispering in Latin. The orderly says,
Don't feel bad. The top level's just the tip of the iceberg. The crest of the wave. How many of us can belong to an elite like that?
I cough and choke, fighting for breath, shuddering with panic. Then I calm myself and force myself to breathe slowly and evenly through my nose. The tip of the iceberg. Do you think the organic brain moves by some kind of magic? From place to place? From moment to moment? Oh, that's the orderly.
The tip of the iceberg. Do you think the organic brain moves by some kind of magic? From place to place, from moment to moment? Do you think an empty patch of space-time can be rebuilt into something as complex as a human brain without transition dreams? The physical world has as much trouble shuffling data as any computer. Do you know how much effort it goes to just to keep one atom persistent in the very same spot? Do you think there could ever be one coherent, conscious self enduring through time without a billion fragmentary minds forming and dying all around it? Transition dreams blossoming and vanishing into oblivion. The air's thick with them. Look!
I twist my head around and stare down at the floor. The trolley is surrounded by convoluted vortices of light, rainbow sheets like cranial folds, flowing, undulating, spinning off smaller versions of themselves.
What did you think? You were Mr. Big? The one in a billion? The one on top?
Another spasm of revulsion and panic sweeps through me. I choke on saliva, shivering with fear and cold. Whoever is walking ahead of the trolley lays an icy hand on my forehead. I jerk free. I struggle to find some solid ground. So this is my transition dream. All right. I should be grateful. At least I understand what's happening. Bausch's warning has helped me after all. And I'm not in any danger. The Gleisner robot is still going to wake. Soon I'll forget this nightmare and carry on with my life as if nothing had happened. Invulnerable. Immortal. Carry on with my life. With Alice, in the house with the giant vegetable garden? Sweat flows into my eyes. I blink it away. The vegetable garden was at my parents' house. In the backyard, not the front. And that house was torn down long ago. So was the supermarket opposite the railway station. Where did I live then? What did I do? Who did I marry? The orderly says cheerfully,
So-called Alice taught you in primary school. Miss something or other. A crush on the teacher? Who'd have guessed?
Then do I have anything straight? The interview with Bausch?
Ha ha! Do you think our clever friends at Gleisner would have come right out and told you all that? Pull the other one.
Then how could I know about transition dreams?
You must have worked it all out for yourself, from the inside. Congratulations.
The icy hand touches my forehead again. The murmured chant grows louder. I screw my eyes shut, racked with fear. The orderly says thoughtfully,
Then again, I could be wrong about that teacher. You could be wrong about that house. There might not even be a Gleisner Corporation. Computerized copies of human brains? Sounds pretty dodgy to me.
Strong hands seize me by the shoulders and legs, lift me from the trolley and spin me around. When the blur of motion stops, I'm flat on my back, staring up at a distant rectangle of pale blue sky. Alice leans into view and tosses in a clod of soil. I ache to comfort her, but I can't move or speak. How can I care so much about her if I didn't love her, if she was never real? Other mourners throw in dirt. None of it seems to touch me, but the sky vanishes in pieces. Who am I? What do I know for sure about the man who will wake inside the robot? I struggle to pin down a certain fact about him, but under scrutiny everything dissolves into confusion and doubt. Someone chants, ashes to ashes, coma to coma. I wait in the darkness, colder than ever. There's a flickering of light and motion around me. The rainbow vortices, the eddies of transition dreams, weave through the soil like luminous worms, as if even parts of my decomposing brain might be confusing their decay with the chemistry of thought, reinterpreting their disintegration from within, undistracted by the senses, or memory, or truth. Spinning themselves beautiful delusions, and mistaking death for something else entirely. And that was Transition Dreams by Greg Egan. And with that, I will have to scooch. Hopefully, people have enjoyed. If you didn't enjoy, I'm sorry. If you did enjoy, great. I'm happy that you enjoyed. Me bringing you any modicum of pleasure is excellent. That is exactly why I'm doing this. Also because it's kind of fun. So there. Ha. So yeah, if you do dig this, you can catch me, since you're probably watching this after the fact on YouTube. You can catch me live every Friday at about noon Eastern Standard / Eastern Daily Time. Um, I do it every Friday on Free Read Fridays. I also have a Mecha Mondays stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent, as well as a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do something Warframe related for a couple hours. All right, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good one. Stay safe, stay sane, and just remember that everything you're experiencing is, in effect, a transition dream. Isn't that a nice thought? control the horizontal and the vertical, etc., and so on and so forth.